So, in this entanglement, roles and identities blur. I think it's interesting now that we can't talk so much about artists or curators or theorists as completely separate institutions. They're all mixed together. They're all somehow embedded. You know, there's that term of embedded journalism, which I think doesn't apply only to the military, but applies to all political coverage, you know, where the journalists are actually part of the whole system. Yeah, but also I think there are embedded artists and embedded curators and embedded theorists. I think this idea of embedding, which I'd rather call entanglement, but I think it comes close to embedding, which is a difficult term because I think it instrumentalizes the journalist. Yeah? You think about the embedded journalist in Iraq is somebody who's basically fighting the war alongside the American troops, and you know, whatever distance he might try to have is basically impossible because he's standing behind one gun looking at another gun pointing at it. So that embedding creates difficulties. But identities blur, which is good. I mean we should think about moving away from an identitarian politics, from an idea of defining ourselves according to where we're from, according to what our ancestors did, if you like, and thinking about how we can create some distance from that while not forgetting it. So as they remain, certain challenges remain, and I think these are the challenges which that building that I spoke about needs to respond to or to answer. That building being the museum. How to depict these invisible structures in visual form. It's interesting that the idea of power being visible and invisible, I think, has to talk to artists, not particularly visual artists. I mean, this is a direct connection. How can we make power visible? I think, and I'll go back to this about Picasso or something like that, I think most artists, or many artists, to some extent busy with that. You know, you think about Hussein's work, which we showed in the Biennale in 2005, in this building, actually. Previous incarnation of this building. But you know, he was showing the power of those horses and what they represented at one time when they were here, when they were taken away, and when they came back. They became a metaphor for how to make power visible. Talked about heroes and horses. Talked about how these power figures, you know, who exist in these historical parks and squares across Europe, how they represented themselves. How that was a way of making power visible. I think there are many examples of this. How do we depict the invisibility of the market, the invisibility of God, the inevitability of the military, in ways that we can take them out of the invisible or out of the inevitable and into the process of decision making, the process which we might have agency about. How to restart history. I'm kind of beginning to think about that and talking to that with you about how history might begin in terms of the idea of a planetary discourse, in the idea of a global public, a global demos, a global people which will produce a global democracy. You know, we're so far away from even discussing these things. How do we create that? And I think that art has a role in at least suggesting that it might be possible. And even in my most optimistic moments, I think that these art institutions, that this planetary language that they're developing is part of that, because art and politics are closely married. Artists are always subject to responding to politics. So is in this fragile plant of Biennale art, this is a fragile plant of contemporary art, is there a language which might develop a global demos eventually, and therefore shouldn't we investigate it? And how can we, and this is my struggle of course, give up the concept of the avant-garde while still promoting emancipation, because I want to do that. Yeah, I'm an old communist. I mean, I still think that emancipation is still a valuable part of our capacity as human beings, that we can emancipate each other as well as emancipate ourselves. And how can we still have that discourse? How we can still talk about emancipation in the current situation, in the period where the end of history. I always think about the end of history. There's another way in which it was described when talking about Stalinist Russia by George Orwell, when in the book 1984, Winston, who's the character, who's the main character in the book, has to go to room 101, and at one point he says to one of his torturers, he says, but how do you imagine the future? How do you imagine this is going to end? Yeah? I mean, this seems insane. And he says, just imagine a foot stamping on a human face forever. I think that's also something quite close to the end of history. So how can we start that idea of emancipation again? And how can we construct that planetary public discourse that I was talking about? And how can art, particularly, claim the political rather than answer to politics? I've had, I'm sure, that a lot of people who work in the institutional structure are endlessly accounting for everything, yeah? Endlessly writing reports, accounting to the politicians for what they do. That's a control system. It's not about the needs to account for that because of any legal reasons. It's about control. And how can we start to talk about those relationships of control, which are done through the administration, through the bureaucracy? You know, when fascism comes to Western Europe again, it will be done through the bureaucracy. It won't be done as ideology. It'll just be done as an unfortunate inevitability that you as an immigrant have to be sent away because we as bureaucrats have been instructed, understandably, to see you as a threat. But it's nothing personal. Yeah, that's how it's going to happen. So how can we challenge those powers? Maybe that's a bit big. I'm going to try and move to the second topic now, and I realize I'm running out of time, aren't I? So I'll try and go quickly. But I wanted to introduce the idea that the museum collection, this stuff here, is a tool, not a treasure chest. And traditionally the museum is seen, even from its beginnings in the Louvre in Paris, again, the museum beginning with the period of time that I'm talking about, 1789 and its consequences, that the public museum has been seen rather as a treasure chest. You know, the emphasis has been on conservation, on restoration, on keeping the things as they were. But what if we stop seeing it so much as a treasure chest? We don't have to abandon it entirely, but start seeing it as a tool. And a tool to write history, a tool to rewrite history, a tool to remember and forget, and remember and forget, and forget to remember, and remember to forget. What about if that becomes that collection? And particularly in Western Europe, can it become that kind of tool where we, can it become that kind of tool where we can not only rewrite our own history, but try to make a contribution to something which is happening like a world or a planetary discourse, a planetary history. I'll try and explain that. What I mean is that Europe is in decline, Western Europe is in decline. It's clear, there's nothing that can be done about it, it's fine. That's why I say the cuts in the Netherlands are fine. I mean, in the end, something like the Van Abbemuseum has to move to Istanbul or Shanghai or Beijing or wherever. Yeah? That's where it has to end up. It won't stay in Eindhoven. That's clear. Fine, no problems with that at all. But there were things about that European modernity, like emancipation, like the revolutionary emphasis, like certain Marxist histories, that are worthwhile preserving. So how can we as Europe not only hand that on to somebody else, I don't believe in that, but take our part in a global discourse? Europe will still be there, Europe will still be part of the world, it just won't be leading it anymore, but it'll be a part of it. And you know, from my ethnicity, from my position, how can I contribute to being part of the world and make this collection work as being part of the world? Not give it up, not destroy it, not say, oh, you know, take away the I mean, there's a tendency in Europe at the moment. You have to be incredibly childish to say, okay, we won't have our empires anymore, so we're going to take away all our tools and we're going to keep them, take away all our toys, rather, and we're going to keep them in Europe. Yeah? We're not going to let you see them anymore. Yeah? Think about immigration politics. Yeah, it's incredibly stupid, incredibly dumb what's going on. But how can we not take them away, but also not say, oh, you don't need this, you've got your own histories to write. You don't need this. I'm talking to somebody in China or Indonesia or whatever. Turkey's a different case. I'm not talking to here. But how do we then share that while being part of the world? Not retreating from the world, not giving up, not dying out, but becoming part. And I think that's where the collection as a tool becomes important. And this is a short quote from Benjamin, and I don't think I have time to really go into it, but the last sentence is maybe the most important. What he's arguing for, and he talks about historical materialism, which is of course part of the determinist idea, historical determinism is part of historical materialism. But he says that in every era, the last sentence here, in every era the attempt must be made anew to wrest tradition away from a conformism that is about to overpower it. The conformism that we have now is a rhetoric either of a restored European hegemony, which is nonsense, but exists in people's heads as they use the modernity in their heads to match the contemporary world that we see, and that splits, and then you get the kind of fascist reactions which we're seeing. Yeah? Or the sort of Zizek, more enlightened narrative is Europe's ended, let's forget it anyway. You know, what I was just talking about. I think those two are rather conformist ways of dealing with the tradition. And I want to see whether we can wrest that away from either despair or some sort of sick, what would you say, hubris, some sick idea that that Europe could once again dominate the world. And I think Benjamin allows us to do this. He says maybe right at the beginning, which is very important, I think, to articulate the past historically, in other words, to take the past and give it a story, give it a narrative, because history is a narrative about the past, does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. In other words, it's rewritten at every moment, and the urge to rewrite it should be done through wresting it away from the tradition that is always about to overpower it.